The first gunshot had been a warning. The second tore through flesh and bone. Rebecca Thornton knew the difference between these sounds all too well. 3 years alone on the Texas frontier had taught her to distinguish between the sharp crack of a rifle fired into the air and the muffled thud of a bullet finding its mark in living tissue. This sound, the one echoing across the golden plains as dusk settled over her small homestead, was unmistakably the latter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She paused at her wash basin, soap-slick hands dripping onto the parched earth of her yard. The late August heat shimmered above the horizon, distorting the silhouette of the cottonwood grove that marked the boundary of her property. Another shot rang out, followed by distant shouts. White men's voices, their words indistinguishable, but their tone unmistakable. The fevered excitement of a hunt. Rebecca dried her hands on her apron and moved toward the cabin with practiced efficiency. She didn't run. Running attracted attention, but her movements were purposeful as she retrieved the Winchester rifle from its mount above the door. Her husband Nathan had insisted she learn to shoot before they left Missouri in '46. "The frontier doesn't forgive weakness," he'd said. By the time typhoid took him a year later, leaving her alone with 40 acres and a half-built dream, she could outshoot most men in the county. The voices grew louder. 5 riders crested the low hill to the west, their horses lathered with exertion. Rebecca recognized them instantly, Montgomery's boys from the Double M Ranch, led by the eldest son, William. They weren't bad men exactly, but they were young, reckless, and had developed a particular hatred for the Comanche after losing 2 herd dogs to a raid last spring. "Mrs. Thornton!" William called out, reining his horse to a stop at her fence. Line, sweat streaked the dust on his sunburned face. "You seen anything unusual today? Any Indians?" Rebecca kept her rifle visible but pointed downward. "Nothing but coyotes and jackrabbits, William. What's happening?" The young rancher spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Caught a Comanche scout watching our herd. Put a bullet in him, but he made it to the brush. Tracking shows he's headed this way." She kept her expression neutral despite the chill that ran through her. "Alone, far as we can tell, probably sent ahead of a raid." William's eyes narrowed. "You should come with us to town. Not safe for a woman alone if there's Comanche about." "I appreciate the concern," Rebecca replied, "but I've got livestock to tend. Can't abandon them." William frowned but didn't press the issue. They all knew Rebecca Thornton hadn't survived 3 years alone by being careless or by showing fear. "Suit yourself. We'll circle back after we find him. Probably finish what we started." He didn't need to elaborate on what finishing entailed. As the riders moved on, following a blood trail only they could see in the fading light, Rebecca returned to her cabin. She latched the door, checked her ammunition, and settled in for a vigilant evening. The Montgomery boys rarely found what they sought when pursuing Comanche. The natives' skill at disappearing into the landscape bordered on supernatural, according to local law. Night fell completely. Rebecca kept her lamp unlit, allowing her eyes to adjust to the darkness. Through the cabin's single window, the grasslands were transformed into a silver ocean under the 3/4 moon. She scanned the horizon methodically, the way Nathan had taught her, focusing on areas where the natural pattern broke. Just before midnight, she saw it, a disruption in the grass near the old oak stump, 30 yards from her door. Something, or someone, was dragging itself across the ground with agonizing slowness. Rebecca watched, her breath shallow, as the figure collapsed near her water trough. Human, definitely, though in the moonlight she couldn't discern more. She waited another 20 minutes, ensuring there were no others, before making her decision. Winchester in hand, she slipped out the back door and circled wide, approaching the fallen figure from behind. The smell reached her first. Blood and sweat and something else, unfamiliar but distinctly human. Then details emerged: long black hair, a body adorned with symbols painted in ochre and white, a hunting knife still clutched in one hand. A Comanche warrior, just as William had claimed, and he was still alive. Rebecca stood frozen, rifle trained on the man's back. Every story she'd heard since arriving in Texas territory told her to either shoot or run back to the cabin and bar the door. The Comanche showed no mercy to white settlers. They took scalps and captives, burned homesteads, and left mutilated bodies as warnings. By all accounts, they were savages, the very word the Montgomery boys had used. Yet as the wounded man shifted, slightly moonlight revealed his face, and Rebecca's certainty wavered. He was young, perhaps 25, with strong features contorted in pain. Blood soaked the left side of his buckskin shirt where William's bullet had found its mark. His breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. This wasn't a nightmarish savage from fireside tales. This was a dying man. As if sensing her presence, his eyes fluttered open. Dark, intelligent eyes fixed on her face, on the rifle aimed at his heart. No fear registered in his gaze, only a calm acceptance that Rebecca found more unsettling than any threat could have been. He said something, a single word in his native tongue, before his eyes closed again. Rebecca lowered her rifle slightly. She'd crossed the Missouri into Kansas, and then pushed south into Texas with nothing but Nathan's promises and her own stubborn hope. She'd buried her husband with her own hands when the fever took him, dug the grave in soil still strange to her. She'd learned to drive off wolves and coyotes, to find water during drought, to keep the garden alive when the sun seemed determined to scorch every living thing from the earth. She'd survived by being practical, by making hard choices. The practical choice stood clear before her: either put this warrior out of his misery with a clean shot or leave him to die slowly of blood loss and infection. Either way, his death was certain. Either way, she would be safer once he was gone. But something in those dark eyes had reached past her fear, past 3 years of frontier warnings and terrible stories. Something that reminded her that before the land had drawn boundaries between peoples, it had taught a simpler truth: that all living things struggled for survival, and all faced death alone unless compassion intervened. "God help me," Rebecca whispered, lowering her rifle completely. "This is either mercy or madness." Moving cautiously, she approached the wounded warrior. He didn't stir as she knelt beside him, her calloused fingers finding the pulse at his neck, weak but steady. The bullet had torn through muscle just below his left collarbone, leaving a ragged exit wound that still seeped dark blood. If infection hadn't set in yet, it soon would. Rebecca made her decision. With strength born from years of frontier work, she hoisted the unconscious man partly upright, supporting his weight against her shoulder. He was lighter than she'd expected, his frame lean and wiry rather than massive. Step by agonizing step, she half-dragged him toward her cabin. Each movement left a damning trail in the silver-tinged grass, a path that would lead the Montgomery boys directly to her door if they returned tonight. But the prairie wind was rising, already beginning to smooth away the shallow impressions. By morning, perhaps all evidence would be gone. Inside, she lowered the warrior onto the bearskin rug before the cold hearth. Working quickly, she tore strips from an old sheet for bandages, set water to boil, and gathered what few medical supplies she possessed: whiskey for disinfecting, needle and catgut thread for stitching, honey from her single precious hive to ward off infection. As she cut away the bloodied buckskin shirt, Rebecca wondered at her own actions. 3 years of solitude had apparently driven her to insanity, or perhaps back to a humanity that the harsh frontier had nearly stripped away. Either way, she had made her choice. This man would live or die under her care, and she would face whatever consequences came with the morning light. The warrior's eyes opened as she began cleaning the wound. Though pain flickered across his features, he made no sound. His gaze followed her movements with wary intensity. When she reached for the whiskey bottle, his hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping her wrist. Rebecca went still. "I'm trying to help you," she said, though she knew he likely didn't understand English. "This will hurt, but it might save your life." Something in her tone must have conveyed her meaning. He released her wrist slowly, then nodded once, a gesture so universal that it startled her. Communication, however rudimentary, understanding. She poured the whiskey over the wound. His body tensed, a harsh breath escaping through clenched teeth, but otherwise he remained stoically silent. As Rebecca worked to stitch the jagged flesh together, she found herself speaking softly, partly to calm her own nerves. "My name is Rebecca Thornton." She touched her chest, then gestured to him questioningly. For a moment she thought he would remain silent. Then he spoke, voice rough with pain but surprisingly deep. "Tashunka, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Dawn brought a fragile peace to the cabin. Tashunka had finally succumbed to exhaustion. After Rebecca finished dressing his wound, he slept now on her bearskin rug, his breathing steadier than it had been hours before. Rebecca had kept vigil throughout the remainder of the night, dozing fitfully in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap. Morning light revealed more about her unexpected guest. His face was noble in repose, high cheekbones and a strong jawline framing features that spoke of both intelligence and hardship. Various scars marked his copper skin, evidence of a warrior's life. The ochre and white paint on his chest and arms had smudged during the night, but she could still make out patterns that likely held significance she couldn't comprehend. The rawhide pouch around his neck remained intact. Rebecca had left it untouched, sensing it held spiritual importance. Around his upper arm was a band of intricately woven horsehair adorned with 3 eagle feathers, another symbol whose meaning she could only guess at. Rebecca moved quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush. As she worked, she contemplated her situation with the clear-eyed pragmatism that had kept her alive on the frontier. She had 3 days' worth of food for 2 people if she rationed carefully. The spring behind her cabin provided water, but venturing out to fetch it might expose them to watchful eyes. Most concerning, the Montgomery boys had promised to return. A soft groan from the bearskin rug interrupted her thoughts. Tashunka had awakened, his dark eyes now alert, despite the pain that tightened his features. He made no attempt to rise, seemingly aware of his body's limitations. "Water?" Rebecca asked, miming drinking. He nodded once. She brought a tin cup to his lips, supporting his head as he drank with measured sips. When he had finished, he studied her face with unsettling intensity. "Why?" he asked in accented but clear English. The single word startled Rebecca. "You speak English?" "Some words. Trade words." He gestured to his bandaged wound. "Why help enemy?" Rebecca considered how to answer. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure herself. "You're not my enemy," she said finally. "Just a wounded man who needed help." Tashunka's expression remained unreadable. "Others come for me. Soon." The statement wasn't a threat, merely a fact delivered with certainty. Rebecca had suspected as much. Comanche rarely traveled alone. "Your people," he nodded. 3 sons. They come. 3 days. The same timeline she had already calculated based on her dwindling supplies. Rebecca moved to the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of the Montgomery boys. The plains stretched empty under the morning light, but that meant little. Eyes could be watching from any fold in the land. "Those men who shot you," she said, turning back to Tashunka. "They'll return too." He touched his wound carefully. "Men who hate. I know this kind." "Why were you near their ranch?" Rebecca asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Tashunka's eyes narrowed slightly. "Watch only. Count horses. No raid." He gestured. "Toward the north. Hunters come soon. Need to know safe paths." Rebecca understood the implication. He had been scouting, assessing potential dangers for his tribe's hunting party. Not preparing for a raid as William Montgomery had assumed, but gathering intelligence to avoid conflict. The distinction felt important. She brought him a small portion of cornmeal mush. He struggled to sit up, refusing her assistance with a slight shake of his head. Pride, she recognized. The universal reluctance of strong men to appear weak, even. When badly injured, as he ate, Rebecca took stock of her situation. She had aided a Comanche warrior, an act that would be seen as treason by most settlers. If discovered, she faced ostracism at best, violence at worst. Yet turning him out now, wounded as he was, would be a death sentence just as surely as if she'd shot him the night before. "Your name," Tashunka said, interrupting her thoughts. "What meaning?" "Rebecca," she replied. "I don't know its meaning. It's from an old story about a woman who left her home to marry a man she'd never met." A faint smile touched his lips. "Your story too?" The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. She had indeed left everything familiar to follow Nathan, to this untamed country, knowing him little more than a year before their marriage. "And yours?" she asked, deflecting. "What does Tashunka mean?" "Moving horse," he replied. "Father saw horse running when mother birthed me." The conversation lapsed into silence as they both ate. Despite the strangeness of the situation, Rebecca found the quiet companionship oddly comforting after years of solitude. Even wordless interactions with another human being eased something within her that had grown hard from isolation. The moment shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Rebecca moved to the window, heart hammering against her ribs. Two riders approached from the east, not the Montgomery boys, but James Sullivan and his son Matthew, from the neighboring homestead. "Hide," she said urgently, helping Tashunka to his feet. She guided him to her small root cellar, accessible through a trapdoor beneath the braided rug. The space was barely large enough for a man to lie flat, designed for storing potatoes and preserves rather than concealing warriors. Tashunka descended awkwardly, his wound clearly causing him pain despite his stoic expression. "Be careful," he said, as she prepared to close the trapdoor. "Not all enemies look like enemies." The cryptic warning lingered as Rebecca smoothed the rug back into place and moved to the door. She stepped onto her porch just as the Sullivans reached her fence line. "Morning, Rebecca," James called, removing his hat. Unlike the brash Montgomery boys, Sullivan was in his 50s, a widower who had settled his homestead 5 miles east, 2 years before. "Thought we'd check on you." Montgomery boys were making quite a fuss in town about a Comanche scout. "They stopped by yesterday," Rebecca confirmed, keeping her voice casual. "Haven't seen any sign of trouble myself." Matthew Sullivan, barely 20 and already showing his father's stern features, studied her cabin with obvious suspicion. "Mind if we water our horses? Been riding fence lines since dawn." It was a reasonable request. One neighbor to another. To refuse would raise questions she couldn't answer. Rebecca gestured toward the water trough. "Help yourselves." As Matthew led the horses to water, James lowered his voice. "Listen, Rebecca, you should know. People are talking. After what happened to the Henderson place last summer, folks are jumpy. 3 settlers killed, and that little girl taken." He glanced toward the horizon. Army patrol spotted a Comanche hunting party moving south. "Could be nothing, but—" "I appreciate the warning," Rebecca replied. "I'm being careful." Matthew had finished watering the horses, but seemed reluctant to leave. He circled Rebecca's cabin slowly, eyes tracking something on the ground. Her heart sank as she realized what he'd noticed, the faint bloodstains and disturbed earth where she'd dragged Tashunka inside the previous night. The morning dew had made them more visible, rather than erasing them as she'd hoped. "Pa," Matthew called. "Come look at this." James joined his son, kneeling to examine the stains. His weathered face hardened as he straightened up. "That's blood. Fresh, too," Rebecca thought quickly. "Shot a coyote that was after my chickens last night," she said, the lie coming more easily than expected. "Dragged it off behind the woodpile." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Mind if I take a look?" Before she could object, he strode toward the woodpile. Rebecca forced herself to remain calm, though panic fluttered in her chest. There was, of course, no coyote carcass to be found. "Nothing here," Matthew called back, suspicion evident in his tone. James studied Rebecca's face carefully. "Rebecca, if you're in some kind of trouble—" "No trouble," she insisted. "Must have dragged it further than I thought. Or maybe the scavengers got to it already." The explanation was weak, and all three of them knew it. James exchanged a look with his son that spoke volumes. "We should be moving on," he said finally. "Just be careful, Rebecca. And if you need help, fire 3 shots. We'll hear it." As they mounted their horses, Matthew leaned down from his saddle. "The Montgomery boys are organizing a search party," he said quietly. 15 men at least. They're convinced there's Comanche in the area preparing for a raid. Just thought you should know." Rebecca watched them ride away, relief and dread mingling in her veins. Once they had disappeared over the eastern ridge, she uncovered the trapdoor. Tashunka emerged like a shadow, moving with surprising quietness despite his injury. "They suspect," he stated. "Not a question, but an observation." "Yes." Rebecca closed the cabin door, leaning against it heavily. "A search party is coming. 15 men, maybe more." Tashunka nodded grimly. "And my people come from north. 2 storms meet here." He touched his wound, testing its healing. "I must leave before dark." "You're in no condition to travel," Rebecca protested. "The wound could reopen. You'd bleed to death before reaching your people." A hint of softness touched his stoic features. "Then I die under stars, not trapped like fox in den." He gestured around the cabin. "You risk too much already." The truth of his statement hung heavy between them. Every moment he remained increased the danger to them both. Yet the thought of him attempting to cross the open plains alone, injured and hunted, seemed equally impossible. "One more night," Rebecca said firmly. "Rest today. Leave before dawn tomorrow when you're stronger." Tashunka studied her face, perhaps searching for fear or deception. Finding neither, he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her determination if not entirely, agreeing with her reasoning. "One night," he conceded, "then I go." The afternoon stretched long and tense. Rebecca worked around the cabin as normally as possible, aware that distant eyes might be watching. She tended her small garden, fed the chickens and split wood for the evening fire, all tasks that would seem ordinary to any observer. Only the occasional glance toward the horizon betrayed her unease. Tashunka remained inside, conserving his strength. Rebecca had been surprised to find him examining her husband's few books when she returned from her chores: a Bible, a farmer's almanac, and a volume of Shakespeare's plays that Nathan had prized above most possessions. The warrior traced the strange letters with evident curiosity. "You read these marks?" he asked when she entered. "Yes," Rebecca replied, setting down her water bucket. "They tell stories, hold wisdom." Tashunka nodded thoughtfully. "My people have marks too, not on paper, on hide, on rock." He touched the symbols painted on his chest. "Stories in these also." Rebecca's gaze lingered on the intricate designs. "What do they mean?" "This," he indicated a zigzag pattern near his heart, "is lightning, power. This, he pointed to a circular design on his shoulder, is Sun, life-giver. His hand moved to his bandaged wound. This one is Bear, strength to endure pain. The cultural exchange fascinated Rebecca. 3 years on the frontier, yet she'd learned more about Comanche beliefs in one afternoon than from all the settlers, in tales combined. The men who hunt you, she ventured, they don't see these meanings. They do not try to see, Tashunka replied simply. Easier to hate what you do not understand. As evening approached, Rebecca prepared a more substantial meal. Rabbit, stew with the last of her preserved vegetables. They ate in companionable silence, the unlikely pair finding a strange peace in the eye of the gathering storm. When darkness fell, Tashunka insisted on examining the surrounding terrain. Despite Rebecca's protests, he moved silently to the window, studying the night landscape with the practiced eye of a scout. Fire signals, he said suddenly, pointing northward. My people! Rebecca joined him at the window, squinting toward the horizon. In the vast darkness, she could just make out a pinprick of light, flaring briefly from a distant ridge, then 2 more in quick succession. What are they saying? Warning, Tashunka replied grimly. They have found sign of many riders. Coming. This way. The news sent a chill through Rebecca. The search party Matthew Sullivan had mentioned was mobilizing sooner than expected. How many of your people come? She asked. 20, maybe more. Hunting party with women and children. His expression hardened. If white men find them first, there will be blood. The statement hung in the air between them, a simple truth with terrible implications. Rebecca had seen the aftermath of such encounters before. Bodies from both sides left broken and mutilated, fueling the next cycle of vengeance. There must be a way to prevent it, she said, more to herself than to him. Tashunka studied her face in the fading firelight. Why do you care? These are not your people. The question struck Rebecca as both obvious and impossible to answer. Why did she care? 3 years ago she might not have. The frontier had a way of stripping complications from morality. Survival first, all else distant concerns. Yet something had shifted within her since finding this wounded warrior, some dormant sense of a larger humanity awakening. I've seen enough death, she said finally. My husband, neighbors, strangers. It solves nothing. Tashunka seemed to accept this answer. He moved away from the window, wincing slightly as the motion pulled at his wound. Sleep, Rebecca told him. I'll keep watch for a while. Though he clearly disliked showing vulnerability, exhaustion and injury won out. Tashunka settled onto the bearskin rug, his breathing soon deepening into sleep. Rebecca remained in her rocking chair, rifle across her lap, listening to the night sounds beyond her walls, the familiar chorus of crickets, the occasional hoot of a hunting owl, the whisper of wind through prairie grass. Somewhere after midnight, new sounds broke the natural rhythm. Horses, moving at a walk, approaching from the west. Rebecca tensed, checking that her rifle was loaded. She glanced at Tashunka, who had already awakened, instantly alert despite his injuries. Without a word, he moved toward the trapdoor, understanding the need to hide. Once he was safely concealed, Rebecca positioned herself near the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. 5 riders approached, their silhouettes unmistakable. Even in the darkness, the Montgomery boys returned as promised. They dismounted at her fence line, speaking in hushed tones. Only fragments reached her ears. Blood trail ends here, and check the outbuildings first. Rebecca made a swift decision. Better to confront them directly than be caught seemingly hiding something. She lit a lamp, threw a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped onto her porch. It's mighty late for a social call, William, she called out, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. The men startled, hands moving instinctively to their weapons before recognizing her. William Montgomery approached, hat in hand in a show of politeness that did nothing to mask the suspicion in his eyes. "Mrs. Thornton," he greeted her. "Apologies for the hour, but we're tracking that Indian. Trail leads straight to your property." Rebecca feigned surprise. "I've been here all day and haven't seen anyone." "Are you sure?" One of the younger Montgomery boys, Thomas, she recalled, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we followed blood sign. Fresh drops leading right up to your water trough. Then, nothing, like he vanished." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. They had tracked Tashunka with more skill than she'd anticipated. She needed to redirect them, and quickly. "I did find something strange this morning," she admitted, improvising. "Tracks leading from my water trough toward the creek," thought. "It might have been a wounded deer. I was going to check my snare lines in that direction tomorrow." William exchanged glances with his brothers. "Mind if we take a look around your property, Mrs. Thornton, just to be certain?" It wasn't really a request. Rebecca knew refusing would only deepen their suspicions. She nodded reluctantly. "The barn and chicken coop are unlocked, but I'd appreciate if you'd be quick about it. Some of us need our sleep." The men spread out, lanterns casting long shadows as they searched the outbuildings. Rebecca remained on the porch, feigning irritation at the interruption, while her mind raced through possibilities. If they decided to search the cabin itself, Tashunka would be discovered. The trapdoor wasn't particularly well hidden, and she had no doubt these men would be thorough. Thomas Montgomery emerged from the barn, shaking his head at his brother. The others returned from the chicken coop and tiny smokehouse with similar results. William appeared frustrated, running a hand through his hair as he approached the porch again. "Nothing," he admitted, "but that blood trail was clear as day, Mrs. Thornton. Something wounded came here." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Could have been anything, William. Coyote, maybe. There's been one after my chickens lately." William's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sullivan mentioned you told them the same thing this morning. Said you shot it." The trap closed around her lie. Rebecca forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I thought I had. Must have just wounded it." For a moment, she thought William would demand to search the cabin. Instead, he simply nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "We're organizing a proper search party at first light," he said. 15 men, including some of Captain Mason's rangers from Fort Griffin. There's a Comanche hunting party moving south, and we aim to intercept them before they reach settled areas." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Rangers would be far more difficult to mislead than local ranchers. "Be careful," she advised, keeping her voice neutral. "Seems like an unnecessary risk if they're just hunting." William's face hardened. "Just hunting. Mrs. Thornton, have you forgotten what happened to the Henderson family? Or the Miller boy?" She hadn't forgotten. No settler could forget the stories of raids, captives taken, homesteads burned. But now, with Tashunka hidden beneath her floorboards, those stories had acquired new complexity. There were atrocities on both sides of this conflict, a cycle of vengeance with roots deeper than any single incident. "I remember," she said quietly. "I'm simply suggesting that starting a fight might bring the very trouble you're trying to prevent." William studied her for a long moment, something unreadable shifting in his expression. "You've changed, Mrs. Thornton. Time was you'd have been first to support running hostiles out of the county." Before Rebecca could respond, one of the other brothers called from beyond the chicken coop. "Will, found something here." William touched his hat brim in a perfunctory gesture of respect. "We'll be moving on. But I'd keep that rifle loaded if I were you, Mrs. Thornton. Never know what might come calling in these parts." The warning carried an undertone that sent a shiver down Rebecca's spine. As the Montgomery boys mounted up and rode into the darkness, she remained on the porch until their hoofbeats faded entirely. Only then did she return inside and open the trapdoor. Tashunka emerged silently, his dark eyes meeting hers with a question he didn't need to voice. "They're gone for now," Rebecca said, sinking into her rocking chair with sudden exhaustion. But they'll be back at dawn with rangers, and they know something's not right. Tashunka nodded grimly. Then I must leave now. Cannot wait for morning. You can't leave now, Rebecca protested. It's the darkest part of night. Your wound, darkness is protection, Tashunka interrupted, already gathering the few possessions he had arrived with. His knife, the rawhide pouch, a small leather water skin Rebecca had filled for him. I know these lands, can reach my people. Before dawn, Rebecca recognized the futility of arguing. The Montgomery boys would certainly return with reinforcements at first light. If Tashunka remained, discovery was inevitable. She quickly assembled supplies he might need, strips of jerked venison, a small pot of honey for his wound, clean bandages. Take my husband's coat, she said, retrieving Nathan's old buffalo hide jacket from its peg. The nights are cold, and it will hide your markings. Tashunka hesitated, clearly understanding the significance of such a gift. After a moment, he accepted the garment with a solemn nod. I will return it, he promised. Keep it, Rebecca replied. Where you're going, I doubt our paths will cross again. Something shifted in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or a recognition of the strange bond that had formed between them in less than a day. Two people from worlds set violently against each other, finding brief common ground in a shared humanity. My people have saying, Tashunka said quietly. Enemy's face changes when you see his eyes up close. He touched his chest, where the zigzag lightning pattern marked his skin. You have warrior spirit, Rebecca Thornton. Different battle, same courage. The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. She had never thought of her daily survival as requiring courage, merely necessity and stubbornness, yet in his eyes her perseverance held valor equal to any warrior's. The search party heads north at dawn, she reminded him. Your people should avoid the western ridge. Tashunka nodded, accepting the tactical advice without question. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. 3 suns from now. Watch eastern sky at midnight. Why? What happens then? A hint of a smile touched his lips. You will see. With that cryptic comment, he slipped into the darkness, like a shadow dissolving into deeper shade. Rebecca stood motionless, listening as his footsteps faded into silence. An emptiness settled over the cabin, not the familiar solitude she had grown accustomed to over the years, but something new and hollow. She realized with a start that she would miss him, this stranger from an enemy tribe who had shared her fire for less than a day. She secured the door and extinguished her lamp, knowing sleep would elude her for what remained of the night. As she settled into her rocking chair, rifle still across her lap, Rebecca contemplated what dawn would bring. The Montgomery boys would return, suspicious and determined. The rangers would ask pointed questions. And somewhere to the north, Tashunka's people approached, unaware of the search party organizing against them. A collision seemed inevitable. Blood would be spilled, grievances deepened, the cycle of vengeance perpetuated. Unless an idea began to form in Rebecca's mind. Reckless, perhaps even foolish, but possibly the only way to prevent the impending clash. If she could somehow warn the hunting party about the search party's plans, they might avoid the confrontation entirely. But such an action would be seen as nothing short of treason by her neighbors. If discovered, she would face consequences far worse than mere ostracism. Dawn broke with deceptive serenity, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber. Rebecca had dozed fitfully, but rose with the first light, mentally preparing for the day ahead. She had just kindled the morning fire when hoofbeats announced visitors. This time the approaching party was larger, at least 10 riders, including several wearing the distinctive hats of Texas Rangers. At their head rode Captain Mason, a weathered veteran of frontier conflicts whom Rebecca had met twice at the general store in the nearest settlement. She stepped onto her porch to meet them, maintaining the appearance of a woman with nothing to hide, despite the dread coiling in her stomach. "Mrs. Thornton," Mason greeted her, tipping his hat. "Hope we're not disturbing your morning." "Captain," she acknowledged, "quite a gathering for a social call." Mason's eyes crinkled slightly, though his expression remained serious. "Not social, I'm afraid. Montgomery boys report tracking a wounded Comanche to your property yesterday. Need to ask you a few questions." The Rangers dismounted, as did William Montgomery and his brothers. The remaining men, local ranchers and farmers Rebecca recognized, remained on horseback, forming a loose perimeter around her cabin. The implication was clear. This was no casual inquiry, but a deliberate investigation. "I've already told William what little I know," Rebecca replied, striving to keep her voice steady. "Saw signs of some animal at my water trough. Might have been wounded. Nothing more." Captain Mason studied her face. Unlike the Montgomery boys, whose suspicions stemmed from youthful bravado, the captain's scrutiny carried the weight of years, spent reading people in life-or-death situations. "Mrs. Thornton, I've known you to be a straight shooter since your husband's passing," he said finally, "so I'll be direct. We found Comanche tracks heading north from your property. Fresh ones, made sometime in the night. Been following them for the past hour." Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't considered that they would check the area surrounding her cabin before arriving. Tashunka's trail would lead them directly toward his people. "I can't account for what happens on open prairie, Captain," she managed. "Anyone might pass by in the night." William stepped forward, his young face flush with vindication. "She's hiding something, Captain. That Indian was here. I'd stake my life on it." Mason raised a hand, silencing the younger man. "Mrs. Thornton, I understand the frontier places difficult choices before a person living alone. Perhaps you felt threatened. Perhaps you offered aid out of Christian charity without understanding the consequences." The captain was offering her a way out, a chance to confess to a lesser transgression, motivated by fear or misguided kindness rather than deliberate collusion. Rebecca straightened her spine. "I have nothing to hide, Captain, and nothing to confess." Mason sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through graying hair. "Then you won't mind if we search your cabin?" It wasn't a request. 2 rangers were already moving toward her door. Rebecca stepped aside, knowing resistance would only confirm their suspicions. The search was thorough but respectful. The rangers checked every corner, beneath her bed, behind the stove, even examining the bearskin rug where Tashunka had rested. Rebecca held her breath when one ranger's boot stepped directly on the trapdoor, but the man moved on without noticing anything amiss. William, however, was more observant. His eyes tracked across the cabin floor, noting the slight variation in the wooden planks where the trapdoor was set. He knelt, fingers tracing the nearly invisible seam. "Captain," he called, "look at this." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as Mason joined William. The young man pressed against the edge of the trapdoor, causing it to shift slightly. "Hidden storage," William declared triumphantly. "Let's see what Mrs. Thornton's been keeping." "Down there." They lifted the trapdoor, exposing the small root cellar below. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, certain that incriminating evidence remained. Blood on the dirt floor, perhaps, or some item Tashunka had dropped. "Empty," Mason reported after a moment's inspection. "Just a root cellar, like most homesteads have." William appeared disappointed, but not convinced. "He could have been hiding down there when we came last night. She's had time to clean up any sign." The accusation hung in the air, neither confirmed nor refuted by the physical evidence. Mason studied Rebecca's face again, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Thornton," he said finally, "I have a hunting party to intercept before they reach settled territory. Whether you've aided a hostile Comanche or not isn't my primary concern right now, but I would strongly advise you to remain on your property today, for your own safety." The warning carried multiple implications. Stay out of the coming conflict. Don't attempt to warn the Comanche. Don't force me to treat you as an enemy. As the search party prepared to depart, William lingered behind. I know he was here, he said quietly, voice tight with restrained anger. And if I find out you helped him reach his people, I'll make sure everyone in the county knows it. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Be careful what trail you follow, William. It might lead places you don't expect. The young man's eyes narrowed at the cryptic response, but Captain Mason called him away before he could reply. Rebecca watched them ride north, following Tashunka's trail toward his approaching people and almost certainly toward bloodshed. Once they had disappeared over the horizon, Rebecca acted quickly. She saddled her mare, packed minimal supplies, and secured her cabin. The decision she had made during the night now crystallized into action. She would ride east, circling wide around the search party's path, and attempt to reach the Comanche. Hunting party before the Rangers did. It was madness, perhaps. One woman riding alone into Comanche territory, with no guarantee they would listen rather than kill her on sight. But the alternative, doing nothing while men died needlessly on both sides, had become impossible to accept. As she mounted her mare, Rebecca touched the worn gold band still circling her finger. Nathan's ring, the last physical connection to the life she had once expected to live. Forgive me, she whispered, though whether she spoke to her dead husband or to God remained unclear even to her. Then she turned her horse eastward and rode into uncertainty, leaving behind the fragile safety of her homestead for the dangerous territory between two worlds poised for collision. Rebecca rode hard through the eastern reaches of her property, cutting across a dry creek bed that would shield her from view. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day on the Texas plains. She knew the land intimately after 3 years, every ridge, gully, and hidden spring, but venturing this far northeast meant entering territory she rarely traversed. Her plan, hastily formed but driven by fierce determination, was to intercept the Comanche hunting party before they encountered the Rangers. If Tashunka had reached his people, perhaps he had already warned them, but she couldn't count on that. His wound might have slowed him, or he could have been recaptured by the search party following his trail. After 2 hours of hard riding, Rebecca reached Buzzard's Ridge, a rocky outcropping that provided a commanding view of the surrounding plains. She dismounted, allowing her mare to rest while she surveyed the terrain through Nathan's old brass spyglass. To the northwest, dust clouds indicated multiple riders moving at speed. Captain Mason's search party, undoubtedly. They had altered course slightly, suggesting they had lost Tashunka's trail or found signs of the larger hunting party. What troubled Rebecca more was the absence of any sign of the Comanche. Based on the fire signals Tashunka had spotted the previous night, they should be visible somewhere to the north. Their apparent invisibility was both concerning and a testament to their skill at moving across the land without detection. She was about to continue eastward when movement caught her eye. A lone figure on horseback approaching from the northeast, riding with the fluid grace that marked an experienced plainsman. As the rider drew closer, Rebecca's breath caught. Even at this distance, she recognized the distinctive buffalo hide coat the figure wore, Nathan's coat, which she had given to Tashunka. Relief flooded through her. He had survived the night and evaded the search party. But why was he riding alone and back toward her homestead? She whistled sharply, a sound that carried across the open plains. The rider's head snapped up, scanning for the source. Rebecca stood, waving her arm in a broad arc. After a moment's hesitation, Tashunka altered course, riding directly toward Buzzard's Ridge. He approached cautiously, hand resting near the knife at his belt. When he recognized Rebecca, surprise registered briefly before his features settled into their customary watchfulness. "Why are you here?" he asked without preamble. "Not safe. I could ask you the same, Rebecca replied. The Rangers are following your trail north. I thought you'd reached your people by now. Tashunka's expression darkened. Found Rangers scout before dawn. Had to circle wide. He gestured northward. My people come this way soon. Many warriors, women, children. I know. That's why I came. The Rangers, there are at least 15 men, well armed. They're looking for a fight, not a parley. Tashunka studied her face, perhaps searching for her motivation. Why do you warn us? These are your people who come. The question echoed his words from the night before, when he had asked why she cared. Rebecca still wasn't certain she could articulate the answer fully, because 15 men with rifles hunting your people will end with bodies on both sides, she said finally. And because I've seen enough senseless death. Something shifted in his gaze, a recognition, perhaps even respect. Come, he said, gesturing to her mare. We ride together. Find safer path for both. Rebecca hesitated. Riding with a Comanche warrior, actively helping him rejoin his people, this crossed a line far beyond simply aiding a wounded man. It was a deliberate choice to involve herself in the conflict, potentially placing herself between two forces that would view her interventions very differently. Yet she had already committed herself to this course when she left her homestead. With a quick nod, she mounted her mare and fell in alongside Tashunka. They rode northeast, keeping to low ground where possible to avoid silhouetting themselves against the horizon. Tashunka moved with the assurance of someone reading the land, as easily as Rebecca might read a book, noting subtle signs invisible to her eyes, adjusting their course to maintain maximum concealment. Your wound, she observed, as they paused to water their horses at a small seep. How is it healing? Tashunka touched his shoulder, where William's bullet had torn through flesh. Pain teaches strength, he replied, echoing what she suspected was a Comanche saying. Will heal. Despite his stoicism, Rebecca noted the fresh blood staining his bandage. The exertion of riding had reopened the wound, at least partially. They would need to redress it before long, but time pressed upon them, too urgently to stop now. Tell me about your people, she said as they continued riding. The hunting party, who leads them? My father, White Wolf, Tashunka replied. Great war chief. 20 summers ago he fought Texan army. Now seeks peace when possible. The information surprised Rebecca. From settlers' tales, she had expected Comanche leadership to be uniformly hostile toward whites. Why do you hunt so far south? These plains are becoming more settled each year. Tashunka's expression hardened slightly. Buffalo herds grow smaller. White hunters kill for hides, leave meat to rot. We follow remaining herds where they go. He glanced at her. Your people push us from hunting grounds, then wonder why we fight. The simple statement carried the weight of a much larger truth, one rarely acknowledged in settlements or army outposts. The conflict wasn't merely about violent raids or cultural differences, but about survival itself. As settlers claimed more territory for farms and ranches, the buffalo herds upon which the Comanche depended were disappearing, pushing them towards starvation or resistance. Before Rebecca could respond, Tashunka raised his hand sharply, signaling for silence. He tilted his head, listening to something beyond Rebecca's perception. After a moment, he pointed toward a rise about half a mile ahead. My people, he said quietly, just beyond that ridge. Rebecca felt a flutter of apprehension. What reception awaited a white woman riding voluntarily into a Comanche hunting party? Even with Tashunka beside her, she might be viewed as an enemy, or worse, a trap. Will they attack me? She asked bluntly. Tashunka considered the question with appropriate seriousness. You saved my life. I will claim you under my protection. A faint smile touched his lips. But do not show fear. They respect courage, even in enemies. They crested the rise slowly, hands visible to show peaceful intent. Below them, in a sheltered valley beside a small stream, sprawled the Comanche hunting party. Perhaps 50 people in total. 20 were warriors, distinctive with their painted shields and feathered lances. The others were women, children and elders, surrounding travois laden with supplies and what appeared to be fresh buffalo hides. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Within moments, 3 mounted warriors approached at a gallop, weapons ready. Tashunka called out in Comanche, words Rebecca couldn't understand, but whose tone suggested both greeting and warning. The warriors pulled up short, examining Tashunka with evident surprise. One spoke rapidly, gesturing toward Rebecca with obvious hostility. Tashunka responded firmly, placing his hand over his heart and then extending it toward Rebecca in what seemed a formal gesture of connection. After a tense exchange, the lead warrior nodded reluctantly and motioned for them to follow. As they rode down into the camp, Rebecca felt dozens of eyes tracking her movement, curious, wary, some openly hostile. Children darted between lodges to stare at the white woman in their midst, while women paused in their work to exchange worried glances. At the center of the camp stood a commanding figure, an older warrior whose face bore the lines of many seasons, but whose bearing suggested undiminished strength. White Wolf, Rebecca presumed, Tashunka's father and leader of this band. Tashunka dismounted and approached the older man with evident respect, speaking rapidly in Comanche, while occasionally gesturing toward Rebecca. The chief's expression remained impassive, though his gaze shifted between his son and the white woman with keen assessment. After Tashunka finished speaking, White Wolf approached Rebecca's mare. His eyes, dark and penetrating, studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. Instead, remembering Tashunka's advice, she met his gaze steadily. "My son says you gave him life," White Wolf said in surprisingly clear English. "Says you ride to warn us of danger." "Yes," Rebecca replied simply. "Rangers and settlers are tracking him. At least 15 armed men coming this way." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "Why does white woman help Comanche?" It was the 3rd time she had been asked some version of this question, yet the answer remained elusive. Examining her own motivations. Honestly, Rebecca found herself speaking from the heart rather than from careful calculation. "Because I'm tired of graves," she said. "Tired of hearing stories about massacres on both sides. Tired of living in fear when there's enough land for all if we could stop killing each other over it." White Wolf's weathered face remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a truth that transcended the boundaries between their peoples. "Brave words," he said finally, "but words do not stop bullets or arrows." "No," Rebecca agreed, "but they might prevent them from being fired in the first place." The chief considered this, then turned to issue rapid commands to the warriors surrounding them. The camp erupted into activity. Women dismantling lodges, warriors gathering weapons, children being ushered toward horses and travois. "What's happening?" Rebecca asked Tashunka, who had moved to stand beside her. "Father prepares to move." "Your camp," he explained. "Your warning gives time to avoid rangers." Relief washed through her. Her desperate gamble had worked. The hunting party would avoid confrontation rather than engage. But her relief was short-lived as White Wolf approached them again. "They follow my son's trail," the chief said grimly. "Will find us if we simply run. Need to divert them." His penetrating gaze fixed on Rebecca. "You helped my son. Now help my people." The request, or perhaps command, hung in the air between them. Rebecca understood what he was asking. She had chosen a side by riding here, by warning them. Now, that choice demanded completion. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, already suspecting the answer. White Wolf's expression remained solemn. "Speak to these rangers. Tell them we have moved west towards sunset. Buy time for my people to reach safety." "They might not believe me," Rebecca warned. "Some already suspect I helped your son." The chief nodded, understanding. "Dangerous, yes, but fewer die this way." Rebecca glanced at Tashunka, who watched her with an intensity that matched his father's. She had come too far to turn back now. "I'll do it," she decided, "but I need something in return." White Wolf's eyebrows rose slightly. "What does White Woman ask?" "Peace," Rebecca said simply. "A promise that your hunters will avoid settlers' herds and homesteads, at least in this territory." A long silence followed her request. The chief seemed to be weighing not just her words, but her understanding of what she asked, and whether she had the authority to negotiate such terms. "3 moons," he said finally. "We avoid white settlements for 3 moons. After that depends on whether white men hunt us again." It wasn't a permanent solution, merely a temporary reprieve. But it was more than existed now, a beginning, perhaps, of something that could grow if nurtured carefully. "Agreed," Rebecca said, extending her hand in the white man's gesture of a sealed bargain. After a moment's hesitation, White Wolf clasped her forearm in the warrior's grip, an agreement between unlikely allies, witnessed by a camp preparing for flight and sealed with nothing but spoken word. As Rebecca prepared to depart, Tashunka approached, leading her mare. "Dangerous path you take," he said quietly. "Rangers may not listen." "They might not," she acknowledged. "But I have to try." Tashunka nodded, then reached for the rawhide pouch around his neck. He removed it and placed it in her hand. "Protection," he explained, "shows you are friend to Comanche." Rebecca accepted the gift, understanding its significance transcended the physical object. "Will I see you again?" she asked. A smile touched his lips. "3 suns from now, eastern sky at midnight. Remember." With the cryptic reminder of his earlier promise, Tashunka helped her mount. As she rode away from the camp, Rebecca glanced back once to see him standing beside his father, both men watching her departure with expressions that blended concern and respect. She turned her mare westward toward the approaching dust cloud that marked Captain Mason's search party, and the confrontation that would test her newfound commitment to a peace neither side fully trusted, but both desperately needed. The search party spotted Rebecca before she'd ridden half a mile toward them. 4 riders broke from the main group. Approaching at a gallop with rifles ready, she recognized William Montgomery at the lead, his face set in lines of suspicion and triumph. "Mrs. Thornton," he called as they closed the distance. "Thought Captain Mason told you to stay at your homestead." Rebecca reined her mare to a halt, keeping her hands visible. "He did, but I have information he needs to hear." William's eyes narrowed, tracking across the horizon behind her. "Been riding northeast, looks like. Funny coincidence. That's right where we lost the Comanche trail." She ignored the accusation in his tone. "Take me to Captain Mason. What I have to say concerns everyone." The young rancher hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to detain her himself and the proper chain of command. After a moment, he nodded curtly. "Keep your hands where we can see them." They escorted her to the main party, which had halted on a low rise overlooking the rolling prairie. Captain Mason sat astride his bay gelding, conferring with his scouts, while the rest of the men watered their horses at a small creek. His expression darkened when he spotted Rebecca approaching under guard. "Mrs. Thornton," he greeted her voice, tight with controlled anger. "I believe I gave you explicit instructions to remain at your homestead." "You did," Rebecca acknowledged, "but circumstances have changed." Mason dismissed the other riders with a gesture, creating a pocket of privacy despite the men's evident curiosity. "You've got about 1 minute to explain yourself before I have you escorted back home under armed guard." Rebecca met his gaze directly. "The Comanche hunting party has changed course. They're heading west now, toward the Brazos River bottoms." The captain's eyes narrowed. And how exactly would you know that? This was the moment of commitment, the point of no return. Rebecca took a deep breath. Because I spoke with them myself, not an hour ago. A stunned silence followed her declaration. Mason's weathered face revealed nothing, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. When he finally responded, his voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. You rode into a Comanche camp, voluntarily. I did. The same Comanche band we're tracking. The one that includes the warrior Montgomery shot. Rebecca nodded. His name is Tashunka. He's the son of their chief, White Wolf. Mason removed his hat, running a hand through his grey hair in a gesture of profound frustration. Mrs. Thornton, do you understand what you're admitting to? Consorting with hostile Indians is a hanging offense in some parts of this territory. They're not hostile, Rebecca countered. They're hunting buffalo, not settlers. The only blood shed so far was by William Montgomery, firing on a scout without provocation. The young rancher, hovering just within earshot, flushed crimson. He was spying on our herds, planning a raid. He was mapping safe passage for his people, Rebecca corrected, trying to avoid confrontation, not seek it. Mason silenced William with a raised hand. His penetrating gaze never left Rebecca's face. Why are you telling me this? Why come back at all? The question cut to the heart of her decision. Why risk herself for people who had been portrayed as enemies her entire life? The answer had crystallized during her ride back from the Comanche camp. Because I've seen both sides now, she said simply, and neither one wants this fight. White Wolf has agreed to keep his hunters away from settled areas for the next 3 months. In return, I promised they wouldn't be pursued. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly. You negotiated terms. On whose authority? On the authority of someone who's tired of burying neighbors, white or Comanche. Rebecca's voice strengthened with conviction. This territory is big enough for all of us if we stop seeing each other only as threats. The captain studied her. For a long moment, unlike William, whose youth made him quick to judge and quicker to act, Mason had spent decades navigating the complexities of frontier conflicts. He understood that simple narratives rarely captured the full truth of any situation. Let's say I believe you, he said finally, that this hunting party isn't planning raids. That still leaves us with a problem. You've admitted to aiding that wounded warrior, Tashunka, Rebecca interjected. Yes, Tashunka, Mason continued, the name sitting awkwardly on his tongue. The law's clear on this matter. I can't simply ignore it. Rebecca touched the rawhide pouch Tashunka had given her, drawing strength from its significance. The law also recognizes basic human decency, Captain. I found a wounded man and treated his injuries. Would you have done differently if roles were reversed? That's not for me to say, isn't it? You've been on this frontier longer than most. Surely you've seen enough death to last several lifetimes. Something flickered in Mason's eyes. A recognition, perhaps of truths spoken aloud that usually remained buried beneath duty and routine. Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the scouts at the perimeter of their temporary camp. Riders approaching, one called. From the west, Mason immediately shifted from contemplative to commanding. Formation! Defensive positions! The search party scrambled to comply, men grabbing rifles and moving to predetermined positions with practiced efficiency. Rebecca's heart sank. Had White Wolf betrayed their agreement? Had some faction of warriors decided to attack despite their chief's orders? But as the dust cloud resolved into distinct figures, she realized these weren't Comanche riders. 3 men approached, one wearing the unmistakable black coat of a preacher. Beside him rode James Sullivan and his son Matthew, Reverend Parker. Mason greeted the lead rider as the trio reached their position. Didn't expect to see you this far from town. The Reverend, a gaunt man whose severe features matched his Calvinist beliefs, dismounted stiffly. Captain, we bring grave news from Willow Creek Settlement. Rebecca felt a sudden chill. Willow Creek lay 10 miles west of her homestead, a small cluster of farms established just the previous year by families from Tennessee. "What's happened?" Mason asked, though his expression suggested he already anticipated the answer. "Raid," Sullivan answered grimly. 3 homesteads burned, Davidson family all dead. Millers missing, parents and all 4 children. William Montgomery stepped forward, face flushed with vindication. "Comanche." Sullivan hesitated, glancing at Reverend Parker. "That's what we assumed at first. Tracks looked Indian, but Reverend Parker noticed something that doesn't fit." The preacher nodded solemnly. "The bodies were scalped, true enough, but Davidson was shot with a Navy Colt, not a weapon commonly used by Comanche. And the raiders took money, jewelry, and whiskey, left the horses." Mason frowned. "Comanche would take the horses first. Everything else would be secondary." A murmur ran through the assembled men as they processed this information. Rebecca's mind raced. If not Comanche, then who would stage a raid to appear as though it were? "There's something else," Matthew Sullivan added, his young face troubled. "Found this half-burned in the Davidsons' fireplace." He produced a scrap of fabric, part of a man's kerchief with distinctive red and black patterning. Mason examined it, his expression darkening. "I've seen this before. Belongs to one of Morton's gang." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the group. Jebediah Morton led a band of outlaws who had terrorized settlements along the Red River the previous year before disappearing into Indian territory. They were known for their brutality and for deliberately staging attacks to appear as though committed by various tribes, thereby covering their tracks. "If Morton's gang is operating this far south," Mason muttered, "they could be responsible for other raids attributed to Comanche." Rebecca seized the opening, like the Henderson attack last summer, the one William mentioned. The captain's eyes met hers, understanding dawning. "Possibly. It never did sit right with me. Some aspects of that raid didn't match Comanche patterns." "Reverend," Parker cleared his throat. "Captain, if outlaws are masquerading as Indians, shouldn't we refocus our efforts? The real threat to settlers might not be the hunting party you're tracking, but white men exploiting fear of Indians for their own gain." The observation landed with particular weight, coming from a man known for his general distrust of native tribes. Mason glanced at Rebecca, then back to the Reverend, clearly weighing multiple considerations. "Mrs. Thornton claims she's spoken directly with the Comanche hunting party," he said finally. "Says they've agreed to avoid settled areas if we cease pursuit." Sullivan's eyebrows shot up. "You rode into a Comanche camp, alone?" "Not alone," Rebecca replied. "I was escorted by Tashunka, the warrior William shot." Reverend Parker's expression hardened. "Consorting with savages is a sin against God and country, Mrs. Thornton. With respect, Reverend, treating a wounded man's injuries and preventing unnecessary bloodshed seems aligned with Christian teaching." Rebecca countered. "Judge not, that ye be not judged." The preacher's lips thinned at having Scripture turned against him, but before he could respond, Captain Mason made his decision. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced, addressing the entire party. "Sullivan, take 4 men and return to Willow Creek. Secure the settlement and look for any further sign of Morton's gang. Montgomery, you and your brothers return to your ranch. Protect your herds in case the outlaws strike there next." William began to protest, but Mason cut him off. "The rest of us will head west toward the Brazos. If Mrs. Thornton's information is accurate, we might intercept Morton's gang as they flee the area." The captain turned to Rebecca. "As for you, I'm still deciding what to do. You've admitted to aiding a Comanche warrior and riding into their camp without authorization. That's serious enough to warrant detention. And if Morton's gang attacks another homestead while you waste men escorting me back to town," Rebecca challenged. Mason's weathered face revealed nothing, but she sensed he was weighing practicality against protocol. You'll ride with us, he decided finally. At least until we determine if your information about the Comanche hunting party is accurate. It wasn't freedom, but it was better than immediate arrest. Rebecca nodded her acceptance of the terms. As the search party reorganized according to Mason's orders, William Montgomery approached her, eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "This doesn't change anything," he said in a low voice. "You betrayed your own kind. People won't forget that." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "There are more than two kinds of people in this territory, William. Those who want peace and those who profit from conflict. I know which side I've chosen." The young rancher's jaw tightened, but Mason called him away before he could respond. Within minutes, the various groups had separated, riding in different directions with their new assignments. Rebecca found herself near the center of Mason's reduced party, neither prisoner nor fully trusted ally. As they rode westward, following the captain's suspicion rather than her information, she wondered if she had accomplished anything meaningful. White Wolf would move his people to safety regardless. The immediate threat of confrontation had been averted. But had any minds actually changed? Had the underlying cycle of suspicion and violence been disrupted in any lasting way? The answer, she suspected, would come 3 nights hence, when she would discover the meaning behind Tashunka's cryptic promise about the eastern sky at midnight. Captain Mason's reduced search party rode westward throughout the afternoon, following the meandering course of a dry creek bed that offered both concealment and a natural path toward the Brazos River. Rebecca remained under the captain's watchful eye, neither prisoner nor ally, occupying an uncertain middle ground that mirrored her position between two worlds. The men were quieter now, sobered by news of the Willow Creek raid. If Morton's gang had indeed returned to the territory, they faced a different kind of threat than they had prepared for. Not Comanche warriors following traditional patterns of conflict, but white outlaws with no code beyond violence and profit. "Tell me about this chief," Mason said suddenly, letting his horse fall back to ride alongside Rebecca. "This White Wolf, what manner of man is he?" The question surprised her. Few white authorities bothered to differentiate between individual Comanche leaders, treating all as interchangeable threats rather than distinct personalities with varying approaches to the ongoing conflict. "Older than I expected," Rebecca replied carefully. "Carries himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Speaks English well, better than most settlers speak Comanche." "That's not what I asked," Mason prompted. "What manner of man?" Rebecca considered how to articulate her impressions of the chief. Practical, she decided, not driven by hatred, despite having fought Texans for decades. "When I warned him about your search party, he chose to avoid conflict rather than engage. That suggests wisdom rather than fear." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Met him once, years back. Peace talk that fell apart after both sides made promises neither could keep." The captain gazed toward the western horizon. "Lost good men to his warriors. Over the years, lost respect for any I might have called friends who took Comanche scalps." The admission revealed more about Mason than perhaps he intended. A man whose long service on the frontier had left him weary of simplistic divisions between heroes and villains. Rebecca sensed an opening to press her case. "Then you understand why I did what I did," she ventured. "Helping one wounded warrior seemed a small thing against the weight of all that bloodshed." Mason's weathered face remained impassive. "Understanding isn't the same as condoning, Mrs. Thornton. The law exists for reasons beyond personal judgment." "And what does the law say about Morton's gang?" Rebecca countered. "About white men who murder white families while disguised as Comanche, knowing the response will be vengeance against innocent hunting parties." A muscle tightened in the captain's jaw. "The law says they hang." Slowly, the conversation lapsed into silence as they continued riding. By late afternoon, they had reached Bald Ridge, a limestone outcropping that offered clear views of the surrounding territory. Mason dispatched scouts in different directions, searching for signs of either the outlaws or the Comanche hunting party. One returned within the hour, his expression grim. "Fire to the southwest, Captain. Looks like another homestead burning." Mason issued rapid orders, and the party changed course immediately, riding hard toward the distant smudge of smoke on the horizon. Rebecca felt a growing sense of dread. If Morton's gang had struck again, they might have already fled the area. Or worse, they might be waiting to ambush pursuers drawn by the flames. They crested a low rise overlooking Faber's Creek, where Eli Jackson had established a small ranch the previous spring. Smoke rose from the burning barn, but the main house appeared intact. 2 bodies lay in the yard, one near the well, another by the corral. "Approach with caution," Mason commanded. "Could be a trap." The Rangers advanced in practiced formation, covering each other as they secured the property. Rebecca remained on the rise with 2 men assigned to guard her, watching as the grim work of assessment unfolded below. After ensuring no ambush awaited, Mason signaled for her to join them. She dismounted in the yard, the acrid scent of smoke mingling with the metallic tang of spilled blood. "Jackson and his oldest boy," one ranger reported, indicating the bodies. "Both shot, then scalped posthumously." "Wife and younger children?" Mason asked. "No sign. Tracks suggest they were taken. 4, maybe 5 riders, headed southwest." The captain turned to Rebecca. "Recognize anything that might indicate whether this was Comanche or Morton's men?" She surveyed the scene carefully, noting details that seemed incongruous. "Comanche would have taken the horses," she observed, pointing to 3 saddled mounts still in the corral. "And they rarely burn barns while leaving houses intact. The pattern is usually reversed." Mason nodded grimly. "Morton's signature. He takes captives for ransom when possible, makes more profit that way than simply stealing livestock." A chill ran through Rebecca at the implication. Mrs. Jackson and her children, aged perhaps 10, 7 and 4, if she remembered correctly, were now in the hands of men who viewed them solely as commodities to be leveraged. "We need to pursue them," she said, urgency coloring her voice. "Those children—" "We will," Mason assured her. "But first we bury the dead. No one deserves to be left for the scavengers, no matter the hurry." The Rangers worked efficiently, wrapping the bodies in blankets and digging graves on a small knoll overlooking the creek. Reverend Parker would have delivered scripture, Rebecca thought, but in his absence, Captain Mason simply removed his hat and spoke a few words over the rough graves. "Lord, receive these men into your keeping. Grant comfort to those who mourn them, and grant us the wisdom and strength to bring justice to those responsible." As twilight deepened toward night, Mason's expression grew troubled. "Too dark to follow tracks safely now. We'll lose their trail and risk ambush." "Captain," Rebecca ventured, "if I may suggest, Tashunka mentioned that White Wolf's hunting party includes trackers who can follow trail by moonlight. If we could enlist their help—" Mason's eyebrows rose. "You're suggesting we seek aid from the very Comanche we were pursuing earlier today?" "I'm suggesting that both the Rangers and the Comanche have a common enemy in Morton's gang," Rebecca replied steadily, "and that Mrs. Jackson and her children have a better chance of survival if we combine forces rather than working separately." For a long moment, Mason stared at the fresh graves, the weight of command evident in the lines of his face. "It would be unprecedented," he said finally. "Rangers operating alongside Comanche." "This whole territory is unprecedented, Captain," Rebecca pointed out. "We're writing its future with each decision we make." Mason nodded slowly, then turned to his men. "Make camp. Post double watches. At first light, we follow Morton's trail, with or without Comanche help." As the Rangers established their perimeter, Rebecca approached Mason privately. "Let me ride to White Wolf's camp tonight," she proposed. "I can explain the situation, ask for their assistance." The captain studied her face in the fading light. "And if I refuse, would you attempt to slip away regardless?" The directness of the question deserved equal honesty. "Yes," Rebecca admitted. "Those children deserve every possible chance." A hint of what might have been respect flickered in Mason's eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Mrs. Thornton. Most settlers wouldn't risk themselves for Comanche lives. Fewer still would risk themselves for both Comanche and white homesteaders equally." "Perhaps that's the problem," Rebecca replied. "Too many of us drawing lines between who deserves mercy and who doesn't." Mason considered this, then made his decision. "Take Roberts with you. He's my best tracker and served as interpreter during the 46 treaty talks. If White Wolf or his son recognize you, they might listen." Relief flooded through Rebecca. "Thank you, Captain." "Don't thank me yet," Mason warned. "This could still end badly for all concerned, and your legal situation remains unresolved." Within the hour, Rebecca and Ranger Roberts rode eastward, following the directions she had received. At the Comanche camp, they traveled in silence for several miles, the ranger's lanky frame silhouetted against the rising moon. "Captain thinks highly of you," Roberts commented suddenly. "Otherwise, you'd be under guard back at the settlement, awaiting trial." Rebecca glanced at her taciturn companion. "And what do you think, Mr. Roberts?" The ranger adjusted his hat thoughtfully. "Been on this frontier 23 years, seen good men do terrible things, seen so-called savages show more honor than pillars of the church." He shrugged. "Reckon I've learned to judge actions more than backgrounds." They rode in silence for another hour before Roberts raised his hand, pointing toward a distant ridge where a single pinpoint of light flickered briefly. "Signal fire," he observed. "Comanche scout marking our approach. They already know we're coming." Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety. Although Tashunka had claimed her as a friend, approaching a Comanche camp at night with a Texas Ranger was a dangerous gamble. White Wolf might view it as a betrayal of the trust she had established earlier. As they neared the ridge, 3 mounted warriors emerged from the darkness, arrows nocked in bows, but not yet drawn. Roberts raised his empty hands slowly, speaking in halting Comanche. Rebecca heard Tashunka's name among the unfamiliar words. One warrior moved closer, studying Rebecca's face in the moonlight. Recognition dawned, and he lowered his weapon slightly. He spoke to Roberts, who turned to Rebecca. "Says White Wolf expected you might return. They've been tracking Morton's gang since sundown." Hope surged through her. "They know about the Jackson Ranch, the captives." Roberts conversed briefly with the warrior. "They know. White Wolf sent scouts to follow, while the main hunting party moved to safer ground." He paused, listening to more Comanche words. "They'll take us to Tashunka. He's with a group planning to intercept the outlaws before they reach the Brazos crossing." The warriors escorted them along a winding path that followed game trails invisible in the darkness. After several miles, they descended into a sheltered draw where a small group of Comanche had gathered around a carefully shielded fire. Tashunka rose as they approached, his expression revealing surprise at seeing Rebecca accompanied by a ranger. He wore Nathan's buffalo coat open now, revealing his chest markings and the fresh bandage covering his wound. In the firelight, he appeared stronger than when she had last seen him, though the shadows under his eyes suggested he had pushed himself. Hard despite his injury. "Rebecca Thornton," he greeted her, then nodded to Roberts. "Ranger." Roberts dismounted, keeping his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "We come seeking help," he said in English, presumably for Rebecca's benefit. "Morton's gang has taken captives from Jackson Ranch. Captain Mason proposes joint effort to rescue them." Tashunka's eyebrows rose slightly. "Rangers and Comanche ride together? This is new thing?" "Morton's men disguise themselves as Comanche when they raid," Rebecca explained. "They're responsible for attacks blamed on your people." Understanding dawned in Tashunka's eyes. So white. Settlers hunt us for crimes we did not commit. Yes, Rebecca confirmed. Captain Mason is willing to work with White Wolf's hunters to stop Morton and rescue the captives. Tashunka conferred briefly with the other warriors in Comanche, then turned back to them. My father tracks Morton now. 8 warriors with him. He pointed southwest. Bad men head for Brazos Crossing, plan to reach river by dawn. Roberts nodded. Mason's company is camped at Jackson Ranch. 15 rangers, well armed. White Wolf has message for Captain, Tashunka said. Meet at Broken Skull Rock before dawn. Plan together, fight together. His gaze shifted to Rebecca. You stay here. Too dangerous. Rebecca straightened in her saddle. I'm coming. Those children know me. They'll be frightened enough without seeing a familiar face. Tashunka's expression softened slightly. Brave heart, Rebecca Thornton. But this is warriors. Work now? She stays with me, Roberts interjected unexpectedly. Captain's orders. I'm responsible for her safety. After a moment's consideration, Tashunka nodded. We ride now. Long journey before dawn. As they prepared to depart, Tashunka approached. Rebecca privately. Why do you risk so much? First for me, now for these children? The question had been posed to her repeatedly over the past 2 days, yet the answer continued to evolve with each asking. Looking into Tashunka's face, a man she would have considered an enemy just days before, Rebecca found clarity. Because boundaries between peoples are made, not born, she said simply, and what's made can be unmade if we choose differently. Something shifted in Tashunka's expression, recognition perhaps of a shared vision that transcended their different backgrounds. Without further words, he led them from the camp, guiding them through the darkness toward an unprecedented alliance and the confrontation that would test its strength against men who profited from division and fear. As they rode beneath the vast canopy of stars, Rebecca touched the rawhide pouch still hanging around her neck. 3 nights from now, she was supposed to watch the eastern sky at midnight. Whatever Tashunka had planned, she suspected it represented a beginning rather than an ending, the first tentative bridge between worlds that had remained separated, too long by misunderstanding and bloodshed. Broken Skull Rock loomed against the pre-dawn sky like a sentinel marking the boundary between worlds. Named by settlers for its vague resemblance to a human cranium, the limestone formation had served as a landmark for both native peoples and white travelers for generations. Now it would witness something unprecedented. Texas Rangers and Comanche, warriors planning a joint operation against a common enemy. Captain Mason arrived with 12 men shortly before first light, their faces betraying a mixture of wariness and determination. Rebecca and Roberts had reached the rendezvous point an hour earlier, joining Tashunka and 3 other Comanche scouts who had been monitoring the surrounding terrain throughout the night. Mrs. Thornton, Mason greeted her with a curt nod. I see you succeeded in your diplomatic mission. White Wolf is tracking Morton's gang directly, Rebecca explained. Tashunka will guide us to the interception point. The captain surveyed the 4 Comanche warriors with professional assessment. Rather than hostility, you understand what we're proposing? Joint action against Morton, with an agreement to set aside other matters until the captives are secured? Tashunka stepped forward, his bearing as dignified as any military officer, despite his bandaged shoulder. We understand. Morton makes both our peoples bleed. Today, we hunt together. The simple declaration carried weight beyond its words, acknowledgement of common purpose between those who had considered each other enemies for decades. Mason nodded, then spread a rough map on a flat rock. Show me where your father tracks them. Using sticks and stones to mark positions, Tashunka explained White Wolf's strategy. The outlaws were heading for a ford across the Brazos River, likely planning to cross into rougher country where pursuit would be more difficult. 8 Comanche hunters had positioned themselves to monitor the gang's progress without being detected. "Morton has 7 men," Tashunka reported. 3 captives, woman, 2 children. "They travel slow because of prisoners. Numbers favor us," Mason observed, "but they'll use the captives as shields if cornered." Rebecca listened as the 2 men, Ranger and Comanche, discussed tactics with the shared language of those experienced. In frontier warfare, despite their different backgrounds, they understood the same strategic principles, the same terrain challenges, the same desperate calculations when innocent lives hung in the balance. "We must separate Morton from captives," Tashunka emphasized. "Rescue first, justice after." Mason agreed. "My men can approach from the south, while your father's warriors create a distraction from the east. If we time it right, we might extract the Jackson family before Morton realizes he's surrounded." The plan took shape with surprising efficiency, each side contributing expertise without the suspicion that would normally characterize such an encounter. Rebecca marveled at the transformation. 3 days ago, these men would have viewed each other only through the lens of decades-old conflict. Now they bent their minds toward a common goal, setting aside ingrained prejudices in favor of immediate necessity. As sunrise painted the eastern horizon with streaks of gold and crimson, Mason addressed his rangers. "This is irregular," he acknowledged. "Never thought I'd see the day when Texas Rangers rode alongside Comanche, but those are white children in Morton's hands, and White Wolf's hunters are our best chance of reaching them before they're across the Brazos." The men nodded grimly. Whatever reservations they might harbor about their temporary allies were outweighed by the urgency of the mission. Tashunka approached Rebecca as the Rangers mounted up. "You stay with rear guard," he instructed. "Too dangerous at the front, Lizzie." "Children know me," she reminded him. "Mary Jackson is only 4. She'll be terrified." After a moment's consideration, Tashunka nodded. "Stay with Captain then. But when fighting starts, remain behind." The combined force moved out as the sun cleared the horizon, riding hard toward the southwest, where the Brazos cut a winding course. Through the Texas plains, Tashunka led them along game trails and dry creek beds, paths invisible to untrained eyes, but which offered both concealment and swift passage. By mid-morning, they reached a series of low bluffs overlooking the river valley. A Comanche scout awaited them, exchanging rapid words with Tashunka before pointing toward a stand of cottonwoods near the water's edge. "Morton's gang rests there," Tashunka translated. "Make camp before crossing river. White Wolf watches from north bank with 6 warriors." Mason studied the terrain through his field glass. "Good ambush position. We can approach through that dry wash without being spotted." The captain divided his men into 3 groups, 1 to circle behind the outlaw camp, 1 to approach from the riverside, and 1 to remain in reserve with Rebecca. Despite her earlier agreement with Tashunka, she found herself relegated to the safety of the rear guard. "I need to be there when the children are found," she protested. Mason's expression remained firm. "You'll be brought forward once we've secured the area, not before." Further argument proved futile. The Rangers moved into position with practiced stealth, while Tashunka rode to coordinate with his father's warriors on the northern bank. Rebecca watched from the bluff as the complex maneuver unfolded. Ranger and Comanche movements synchronized with surprising harmony. The attack, when it came, erupted with stunning suddenness. White Wolf's warriors sent a volley of arrows into the outlaw camp from across the river, not aimed to kill, but to create confusion and draw attention northward. Simultaneously, Mason's Rangers emerged from the dry wash, rifles raised. "Texas Rangers, throw down your weapons!" Morton's men responded with predictable violence, gunfire erupting from the cottonwood grove. Rebecca watched in helpless tension as the firefight intensified, unable to discern details from her distant position. After what seemed an eternity, but could only have been minutes, a ranger appeared at the top of the bluff, waving his hat in signal. Captain says, come down! We've secured the camp! Rebecca didn't wait for further invitation. She urged her mare down the steep trail toward the riverside, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Had the Jackson family survived? Had the unprecedented alliance accomplished its purpose, or had it dissolved into the familiar chaos of frontier violence? The scene that greeted her at the Cottonwood Grove answered at least some of her questions. 3 of Morton's gang lay dead among the trees. 2 more sat bound and guarded by stern-faced rangers. Of the remaining outlaws, including Morton himself, there was no immediate sign. The captives, she asked the nearest ranger. He pointed toward the river's edge where a small figure huddled beneath a blanket. Mary Jackson sat beside her mother. The woman's arms wrapped protectively around her daughter's shoulders. Both appeared physically unharmed, though their expressions betrayed the trauma of their ordeal. Rebecca approached slowly, not wanting to startle them. "Mrs. Jackson, it's Rebecca Thornton." The woman looked up, recognition and relief washing over her exhausted features. "Rebecca, how—" "The rangers followed your trail," Rebecca explained, kneeling beside them. "Are you hurt? The children—" She broke off, suddenly realizing only Mary was present. "Where's Samuel?" Sarah Jackson's face crumpled. "Morton took him when the shooting started, said he'd kill him if anyone followed." She pointed across the river with a trembling hand. They rode north. Cold dread settled in Rebecca's stomach. Samuel Jackson was 10 years old, the same age her own son would have been had he lived. The thought of the boy in Morton's hands, used as a human shield by a desperate outlaw, was unbearable. Captain Mason approached, his expression grim as he absorbed Mrs. Jackson's words. "How many men with Morton?" "Just 2, Sarah replied. "The one they call Blackie, and another, tall man with a scar across his chin." Mason nodded recognition. "Fletcher, meanest of the bunch, except for Morton himself." He turned to his lieutenant. "Get Mrs. Jackson and the girl back to the bluff. Post 4 men as guard." "What about Samuel?" Rebecca demanded. The captain's weathered face revealed nothing. "White Wolf and his warriors are already in pursuit. Tashunka has gone to join them." "And you're just going to let them handle it alone?" Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm sending 4 rangers to support them. The rest will escort the women to safety." "I'm going with the pursuit party," Rebecca declared, already turning toward her horse. "Mrs. Thornton," Mason began, his tone carrying a clear warning. "That boy knows me," she interrupted. When we find him, he'll need a familiar face." She met the captain's gaze directly. "And you can't spare the men to forcibly detain me, not if you want to catch Morton before he disappears into the cross timbers." For a moment, she thought Mason would order her restrained regardless. Instead, he simply nodded, perhaps recognizing the truth in her assessment, or perhaps acknowledging that she had earned a certain measure of respect through her actions of the past days. "Stay with Roberts," he instructed. "Follow his orders without question. First sign of trouble, you retreat immediately." Rebecca agreed to the terms, though they both recognized the promise might prove hollow once events were in motion. Within minutes, she joined Roberts and 3 other rangers as they forded the Brazos, following Comanche tracks clearly left for them to read. The pursuit stretched through the remainder of the day, a tense chase across increasingly rugged terrain as Morton and his dwindling band fled northward. White Wolf's warriors maintained contact without engaging, tracking the outlaws with uncanny precision while staying just beyond rifle range. By late afternoon, the combined pursuit force, Rangers and Comanche, had closed the distance considerably. They found evidence of Morton's passage growing fresher. Still warm campfire ashes, tracks showing the outlaws' horses had slowed from exhaustion, a waterskin abandoned in haste. As twilight approached, Tashunka rejoined them at a small creek, where they had paused to rest their mounts. "Morton climbs toward Cedar Ridge," he reported. "Horses failing. Boy still lives." He pointed to disturbed earth near the creek bank. Small footprint. Boy walks now because horses cannot carry 3 men and child. Rebecca felt a surge of hope, mingled with renewed urgency. If Samuel was on foot, his ordeal had intensified, but at least he remained alive. "How far ahead?" Roberts asked. 1 hour, maybe less," Tashunka replied. "My father circles ahead with 4 warriors. We'll cut off escape to north." The ranger nodded appreciation for the tactical information. "We'll approach from the south, then. Catch them between us." As they prepared to continue the pursuit, Tashunka placed a hand on Rebecca's arm. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "When we find boy, you call to him. Voice he knows will give courage." The simple acknowledgement of her role, not as combatant but as connection to the frightened child, touched Rebecca deeply. "Thank you." They rode at a measured pace, balancing speed against the need for stealth as they closed the final distance. The cedar-covered ridge rose before them, silhouetted against the evening sky like the backbone of some enormous beast. Somewhere among those trees, a desperate man held an innocent child, with nothing left to lose and every reason to lash out with final violence. Shadows lengthened as the pursuit party dismounted at the ridge's base, continuing on foot to minimize noise. Roberts directed his rangers to spread out in a flanking maneuver, while Tashunka led Rebecca along a game trail that wound upward toward the ridge's spine. They had nearly reached the crest when a child's scream shattered the twilight silence. A sound of pure terror that froze Rebecca's blood. Without conscious thought, she broke into a run, scrambling up the rocky slope toward the source of that desperate cry. She heard Tashunka call her name, felt his hand grasp for her sleeve and miss. Logic and caution evaporated, replaced by the primal instinct to reach a child in danger, any child, regardless of the risk. She crested the ridge breathless, emerging into a small clearing ringed by cedar and scrub oak. The scene before her burned into her memory with terrifying clarity. Samuel Jackson stood at the clearing's edge, Morton's arm locked around his throat, a revolver pressed to the boy's temple. The outlaw's remaining men had positioned themselves behind boulders, rifles aimed at the surrounding forest. "Come out, or the boy dies," Morton shouted, his voice carrying the edge of desperation that made his threat all the more credible. Rebecca stepped forward into the open, hands raised to show she carried no weapon. "Samuel!" she called, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's Miss Rebecca from Willow Creek." The boy's eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of hope penetrating his terror. Morton's gaze shifted to her, surprise momentarily, replacing rage. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Just a neighbor," Rebecca replied, taking another careful step forward. "Let the boy go, Morton. He's done nothing to you." The outlaw's laugh held no humor. "Done nothing? His existence is leverage, woman. Only thing keeping me alive right now." He pressed the revolver harder against Samuel's head, causing the boy to whimper. "Tell those rangers and those savages I see moving in the trees to back off, or I paint this ridge with his brains." Rebecca maintained eye contact with Samuel, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "No one wants more bloodshed. The Rangers only want you, not your men." The lie came easily, a desperate attempt to create division among the outlaws. Release the boy, and Captain Mason might show leniency. For a flickering moment, Morton seemed to consider her words. Then his face hardened. "No deals. I want horses, supplies, and clear passage to the Red River." He gestured with his free hand toward the surrounding forest. "Anyone shows themselves, the boy dies first." The standoff stretched into agonizing minutes as darkness gathered around the ridge. Rebecca remained where she stood, the only visible target, maintaining a steady stream of calming words directed primarily at Samuel, but intended equally for Morton's increasingly unstable attention. Movement flickered at the corner of her vision. Rangers, positioning themselves under cover of shadow, Comanche warriors, ghosting between trees with predatory silence. The net tightened around the clearing, but Morton's gun remained pressed to Samuel's head, his finger on the trigger. A soft voice spoke suddenly from directly behind Morton, Tashunka, who had somehow circled through the cedars unseen to reach the outlaw's blind spot. "Release the boy," he said quietly, "or die where you stand." Morton spun, dragging Samuel with him, the momentary distraction giving Rebecca the opening she needed. She launched herself forward, focusing solely on reaching the child, on breaking Morton's grip around the boy's throat. What followed unfolded in fragmentary images, disconnected moments of clarity amid chaos, her hands grasping Samuel's shoulders, pulling him down and away from Morton's grasp, the outlaw's roar of rage, the deafening report of his revolver firing, pain blooming along her upper arm where the bullet grazed flesh, Tashunka's knife flashing in the fading light. Rangers and warriors converging on the clearing from all sides, as Morton's men realized the futility of resistance. When stillness finally returned, Rebecca found herself on her knees, Samuel clutched against her chest, the boy's tears soaking her shoulder as he shuddered with shock and relief. Morton lay face down in the dirt, Tashunka's knee pressed between his shoulder blades as Robert secured the outlaw's hands with iron manacles. "Are you hurt?" Tashunka asked, his dark eyes finding Rebecca's across the clearing. She touched her arm, where the bullet had carved a shallow furrow. "It's nothing. Samuel?" The boy raised his tear-streaked face. "I want my ma," he whispered. "She's waiting for you," Rebecca assured him. "You're safe now." As the rangers secured the prisoners and established a camp for the night, Rebecca found herself seated beside a small fire, Samuel asleep against her side, while Ranger Roberts dressed her wound. The pain had intensified as adrenaline faded, but it remained secondary to the profound relief of the boy's survival. Tashunka joined them, settling cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire. For a long moment, he simply observed the sleeping child, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You risked much," he said finally, meeting Rebecca's gaze. "Stepped into danger, without weapon." "I didn't think," she admitted, "just reacted." Tashunka nodded as though her explanation confirmed something he had already known. Mother Bear needs no plan when cub threatens, acts from heart. He touched the zigzag lightning pattern on his chest. "This is true courage." Captain Mason approached, carrying a tin cup of coffee, which he offered to Rebecca. "Morton's gang won't trouble this territory again," he reported. "Between Rangers and Comanche, we've accounted for all of them." "And White Wolf?" Rebecca asked. "Returned to his hunting party with most of his warriors, left Tashunka and 2 others to see you safely back to your homestead." The implication wasn't lost on her. "And what happens then, Captain? Am I still to be charged for aiding Tashunka?" Mason's weathered face remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. "Circumstances change perspectives, Mrs. Thornton. 3 days ago, I'd have said the law was clear. Today—" He glanced at Tashunka, then back to her. "Today I find myself considering what justice truly requires." He straightened, assuming his formal bearing once more. "We'll discuss your situation once we've returned the Jackson family to safety. For now, rest. We ride at first light." As Mason moved away to check on his men, Tashunka leaned forward. 3 sons, he reminded her quietly. "Tonight, eastern sky at midnight, remember." The cryptic reminder of his earlier promise stirred Rebecca's curiosity, but exhaustion and the events of the day had left her too drained for questions. She simply nodded, stroking Samuel's hair as the boy shifted in his sleep. She must have dozed, for she awakened to Tashunka's hand on her shoulder, the camp quiet around them as most of the rangers slept. Only the guards remained alert, visible as shadowed silhouettes against the star-filled sky. "Come," Tushunka whispered. "It is time." Carefully extricating herself from Samuel's sleeping form, Rebecca followed the Comanche warrior to the ridge's eastern edge. Below them, the Texas plains stretched vast and silver under the three-quarter moon, a landscape both familiar and suddenly strange, transformed by the events of recent days into something more complex than she had previously comprehended. "Watch," Tushunka instructed, pointing toward the eastern horizon. At first, Rebecca saw nothing unusual, just stars scattered across the velvet darkness. Then a flicker of light appeared, rising from beyond the distant horizon. Another followed, then another, until dozens of small flames ascended into the night sky, glowing points moving upward with deliberate grace. "Fire lanterns," Tushunka explained. "My people send them to honor great changes, new alliances, new paths." Rebecca watched in wonder as the paper lanterns continued their ascent, each carrying a small flame that illuminated intricate designs painted on their surfaces. Lightning, bolts, sun circles, bear symbols alongside crosses, stars, and other markings she recognized from settler traditions. "White Wolf orders this?" she asked, voice hushed with awe. Tushunka nodded. "First treaty, not written on paper, written in sky instead." He pointed to the highest lanterns, now appearing as distant stars themselves. "My father says, sky remembers when papers burn." The profound symbolism brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. Here was acknowledgement from both sides that something unprecedented had occurred. Not merely a temporary alliance against a common enemy, but the first tentative step toward understanding across a divide previously considered unbridgeable. "Will it last?" she wondered aloud. "Or will old hatreds return once Morton's threat is forgotten?" Tushunka's expression remained solemn. "Path has many turns, some forward, some back, but once new path is seen, cannot be unseen." As they stood watching, the lanterns drift heavenward, Captain Mason joined them silently. For several minutes, the three figures, ranger, settler, and Comanche, observed the spectacle without speaking, each absorbed in private thoughts about what had transpired and what might yet come. "Beautiful," Mason said finally. "Never seen anything like it." "New thing," Tushunka agreed. "Like rangers and Comanche hunting together," the captain nodded slowly. "Circumstances forced our cooperation. The question is whether it can continue without such pressure." Rebecca thought of Samuel Jackson sleeping peacefully by the fire after his ordeal, of White Wolf, who had chosen to pursue Morton rather than evade the Rangers, of Tushunka, whose wound from William Montgomery's bullet had become the unlikely catalyst for change. "Perhaps it's not circumstances, but choices that matter most," she suggested. "Each of us decided to see beyond what we'd been taught to expect from one another." The last of the lanterns disappeared into the vast Texas night, their light absorbed, into the greater canvas of stars that had witnessed countless cycles of conflict and rare moments of harmony across the contested plains. Whatever the future held, Rebecca knew her own perspective had altered irrevocably, not through grand philosophy, but through direct experience of the humanity that existed on both sides of artificial dividing lines. 3 days earlier, she had found a wounded Comanche warrior near her water trough and made a choice based on compassion rather than fear. That single decision had rippled outward, challenging assumptions, creating unexpected alliances, and perhaps offering a glimpse of a different possible future for the Texas frontier. As she turned back toward the camp beside Tushunka and Captain Mason, Rebecca touched the rawhide pouch still hanging around her neck, a tangible symbol of the invisible connections that now bound her to both worlds. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with inevitable setbacks and resistance from those invested in continued division. But for tonight, at least, fire lanterns rose in harmony above a landscape temporarily at peace, carrying hope skyward. On fragile paper wings. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.